Hello and welcome to week 3 of Introduction to Diversity. Again, I'm Kevin, I'm your instructor. Today we're going to be talking about discrimination, and the first thing we need to know is the difference between prejudice and discrimination. So, when we're talking about prejudice, again, we're talking about attitudes toward a group of people. Discrimination is actual actions toward a group of people. The book first breaks this down into relative deprivation versus absolute deprivation. Relative deprivation is thinking that there's a discrepancy between you and another group in the way they live. And absolute deprivation is living below the minimum level of subsistence because of a minority aspect. In modern times, we find that in the United States, even though people are discriminated against, they can still work. So it's not necessarily absolute deprivation where they're always living below the level of subsistence. But remember, where you're located in the social class system depends upon your education and your job prestige and your wealth and your overall power. And all of these were restricted to minorities. Minorities had very little access to capital until at least the 1960s. So this is the idea that minorities, albeit they can still get a job and pay the basic bills, they were locked out of higher echelon jobs, education opportunities, wealth, entrance into politics, etc. Okay. The next slide talks about hate crimes. And when you guys look into hate crimes, you'll be relatively shocked. Okay. Hate crimes is when an offender goes after a group because of their race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or disability, for example. Okay, so this is often a violent crime or even just something along those lines, but it's toward a group of people based upon their race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, etc. Okay. There were 5,800 reported hate crimes in 2015, but what you're going to find with hate crimes is they're often never reported. And so it's estimated that there were probably more like 200,000 every year. Okay, the majority of hate crimes are against race and ethnicity, and 25% around about for religion and sexual identification. And again, hate crimes are based upon these prejudicial attitudes. So people then discriminate and they engage in hate crimes, hostility toward another group. And a hate crime is a criminal offense, okay? And when you start studying some of the hate crimes, you'll be really shocked. Like when I started studying hate crimes versus the religious groups, for example. I mean, what you might hypothesize is the group that experiences the most hate crimes, you might be surprised because, again, it turns out that people that identify as Jewish receive half of the hate crimes that are religious based. And then you have to ask questions like why? And then to answer that, you have to look at 2,000 years of history and stereotypes and stigmatization by other groups. And so it's a very deep subject, but it's also sad. Okay, institutional discrimination is something you find nowadays because overt racism is rarely tolerated. A lot of racism is things you don't see, subtle discriminations. As you learned in chapter 2, when you're going to get a job, somebody just looks at your name, and based upon your name and your sex, for example, they choose whether or not to call you back. Okay, so institutional discrimination is just overall practices that are prejudiced toward other groups of people. Okay, again, you'll see this in hiring, you'll see this in mortgage rates, you'll see this in politics. Okay, anywhere where you find the population of the corporation, for example, is heavily toward one sex, for example, the majority male or the majority white, then you have to start asking questions. Is that representative of the United States? Are they hiring with diversity and inclusion in mind, for example? Okay. Institutional discrimination happens way more than explicit prejudice. Okay, so again, you'll see this in employment, education, criminal justice, housing, healthcare, government operations, and that government operations is what you saw in our book when they were talking about the disparity between whites and blacks based upon their name and how much government assistance they receive, for example. Okay, so again, institutional discrimination means that we are denying opportunities and equal rights to other groups of people based upon their race or their ethnicity. And these are things you might not even think about. They might be automatic because they're institutionalized, okay? And then institutional racism, again, this is directly this is institutionalized racism that is toward a group of people, okay? And again, people might not even notice this, but when you are denying mortgage rates to Asians and African Americans, and you have a white person that's in charge of, approving it or not, is race a factor? These are more examples. Again, credit being denied to Hispanics and blacks due to the lack of credit references. IQ testing, which favors whites because historically whites had better access to better schools, which then prepared them for these tests more. Same thing with SAT and ACT. Is that a way of filtering out lower class and upper class people, for example? Should we get rid of those tests? Again, we should always question our measures. That's what we do when we're in science. The criminal justice system, for example, is dominated by whites, and they don't understand the relationship between poverty and crime, in that historically African Americans, Hispanics, Asians were stuck in the lower classes. And so if you ask why is crime higher amongst these races, is it because of their race or is it because they're poor? And again, you start to see through this lens and you start to realize that race and economics are completely intertwined, and that institutionally, white males made sure that women and all minorities could not get into the upper classes. And so they stuck them in the lower classes, which then have higher rates of crime and drug use, etc. But always remember, the criminal justice system is also blind, and that it's a white person who's more likely to have drugs and guns in a car, not a white or a Latino. Okay, some more examples. Jobs eliminate people for criminal convictions. And so if you have higher rates of crime and poverty in the lower classes, then people coming out of the lower classes are more likely to have a criminal conviction, which then stops them from being able to get a good job, which then stops them from being able to get into upper classes. And therefore you have this lower class reproduction from generation to generation of poverty, the culture of poverty. Okay, so again, a lot of people want to point finger at races, but when the truth is it's a culture of poverty. And so if you stick entire groups of people into poverty, you're going to see higher rates of crime and drug use, abuse, etc. Okay, and that's class reproduction. That's a way that white people have maintained power for generations. Okay, Black and Latino applicants are more likely to be passed over for jobs than whites. And again, minorities endure this every day. White privilege means you don't have to think about this kind of stuff. But a minority walking into an interview with someone who's white and male, what goes through their mind? What's the subjective experience of a minority? And again, these are things we can study qualitatively to get at people's experiences of this. Okay, so discrimination today, it is widespread. Institutional discrimination exists everywhere. It is in people's ideologies. It is, in specific regions, for example. Again, does racism increase in the cities or does it decrease in the cities? And again, these are things that we can study, okay? So again, we can go out and measure prejudice and discrimination. It is hard because, again, a lot of it's not reported. But when you start getting into these subjective experiences, for example, I did a focus group of African Americans and they were talking about their stories. And, an African American was with a white woman and they had pulled into a gas station in Alabama. And the man said, "Honey, get back in the car." And she didn't understand because she's white and he's black. And they were in Alabama and there was a truck next to them with a Confederate rebel flag. And he was a black man with a white woman. Is racism higher in other places than in others? It is. Okay, it is. And it's a global phenomena. But again, in America, it might be white versus black versus Asian versus Native. But you go over to Asia, and it might be Muslim versus Hindu. Okay, it might be North versus South Korea. And their prejudice might not be along racial lines, but it's definitely along cultural lines. Okay, so you have a lot of ethnocentrism mixed in there. Okay, when it comes to earnings, white men earn 1/3 more than black men and 2 times what a Hispanic woman earn. Asians are the top earning, but why? And then again, you have to look at a culture at an education level. Educational attainment is the key to many things, okay? Men do outpace women in income. However, what we're starting to see is women are now outpacing men in college education degrees, educational attainment, for example. Are we going to see a shift there with women? And again, the great questions of how do we end discrimination? And one way is deconstruct race. We can get rid of that, change our attitudes towards sexism. We can start to make it more equitable between men and women. become multicultural, and then deconstruct negative meanings against different cultures, all the stereotypes you've ever heard, get rid of them. Again, there's community efforts, government efforts, wealth distribution, great many things. Wealth is the number one disparity between groups of people. And it turns out that if you really want to fix the wealth disparities between the races, the key is to enable minorities to get their own house. Okay? So median wealth of white households is 141,000, 13 times more than black households, and it's growing since 1983. Okay, that means their overall wealth. But how much is 141,000? That's the difference between owning your house and renting your house. Okay? African Americans and other minority groups have had less opportunity to accumulate assets, homes, land, savings that can insulate them and their children and set them up for generations to come. Again, the best way to do this is simply through home ownership. Home ownership is the major disparity between the races when it comes to wealth. 72% of whites own their home, 43% of blacks, 45% Hispanic, and 49% Asian own their own house. So again, if you want to correct the income, fix the institutional discrimination in the mortgage rates, and then maybe we can start to address some of these issues better than we have. Okay. Environmental justice. This one really looks at the association between urban neighborhoods and suburban and rural neighborhoods that are exposed to areas of poor water, nuclear power plants, etc. And what the findings are is you're going to find that minority neighborhoods typically are in these high dangerous environmental areas. So environmental justice is just a really interesting thing that your book was talking about, worth looking into a little bit more, even if somebody want to write about that. Okay, affirmative action. Again, this is the idea of how do we help people that were historically stuck in the lower classes get better opportunities, okay? So it's positive efforts to recruit subordinate group members for jobs, promotions, and educational opportunities, including women, because remember, women are the most discriminated against group in all of human history. More than any other race or ethnicity, culture, country, women, they have historically had it the worst with prejudice and discrimination. But again, we don't really think about that because of male privilege. So it's a good time to, again, start really addressing women's rights. We are in the third wave of feminism. We might need a fourth, okay? Some really good questions. Should we get rid of race from applications? Get rid of people's names from an application. Get rid of the ACT and SAT and let their merits speak for themselves. Will that reduce institutional discrimination for jobs and in colleges, What you find is the alumni from the children who went to Harvard tend to not do as well. Okay, so the idea that Harvard should be recruiting from this culture of people that went to Harvard, that's not how you make the best. What you do is you open it up, okay? Because again, it turns out that alumni children do not succeed better than the average people. So again, some of the systems we have in place just reproduce the same culture, but it's time that we start to blend the culture, because then we'll create a more meritocracy for our society where you rise your way up based upon your merit, not based upon your parents' socioeconomic status, your race, your sex, your sexual orientation, your religion, etc. Okay, so the idea is inequality continues to persist. And again, most of it goes back to the class system. We live in a class system. Okay, some inequality is good. You need inequality because you need to motivate people. Okay, and so incentives such as more money does motivate people. But is there a cap on how much money somebody should earn, for example? Okay, a doctor has to go through 20 years of school, huge sacrifices, that you need some kind of incentive to get them to do that. Otherwise, what's the point of them doing it if a server in a restaurant who doesn't need to go to school gets just as much money as a doctor? So some inequality is good for motivation, and you can see that in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, critiques against communism, for example. But how much inequality is too much? And that's the cool question that we should be asking, because that's where social policy should get in line, okay? And this idea of discriminating people based upon their race and their ethnicity and their sex and their religion, we are just missing out on so many Einsteins, okay? And that's just something we could change. This idea of the glass ceiling, it is in there for your topics for your midterm essay. Again, killer stuff to look at. The glass ceiling is this idea that qualified workers are not being promoted because of their gender or their minority status, okay? This results in an underrepresentation of women and minorities in managerial positions. Okay, this is the way the privileged class has monopolized very high paying jobs, the elite jobs, because they can just pass them on to their friends and their children and the people that went to Harvard and had that culture. Okay, again, you're going to see that most board directors of the companies of Wall Street are white men, only 3% Hispanic, for example, and a lot of people just don't even have somebody that's African American or Hispanic on their board, and again, it's dominated by men. Upwardly mobile women, again, we tend to filter people based upon their sex into specific jobs, whereas women get pushed into sales and human resources. Men are getting pushed into business, and so men are getting pushed into the money jobs and women are getting pushed into the middle level jobs. And the way you advance women is where they get discriminated against the most institutionally is that first promotion. So all women, their biggest barrier is getting that first promotion. Men will get promoted over you 2 times to every one. So if you're a woman, that's what needs changed. How do we level out that first promotion so we can, again, get access to women to these higher paying jobs, better education, etc. Okay? And then to conclude it all, again, look at W.B. Du Bois, fascinating, first African American to graduate Harvard. Again, his idea is he's looking up in New York and the land of dollars and the American dream, and he realizes that there's a veil over that for all minorities. That American dream only existed for white men. And this is 100 years ago, 120 years ago, okay? So this is why we needed a civil rights movement, because we need to let everybody have access, let everybody compete, and through there, then we can really work out who's the best and the strongest, etc. Okay? But if you don't even let somebody compete, if you remove half of women from being able to compete and being able to offer information and to use their knowledge and apply it, then we're missing out on half the information, half the possible candidates for the best jobs to fill those social roles. This is why it's important that the world is not a white male dominated world, because we're missing out on so much more if that's the case. Plus, other people are completely subjugated and stuck in the lower classes, which means they don't have as many life chances, and that is not right, okay? Thank you so much for this week. Make sure you guys look over week 3. Okay, here's your to-do list, the lecture video, the PowerPoint if you want to read through it, do the discussion board, and the quiz. Thank you so much. It's an honor.